The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl's screams along the rapids, and his wrath cracked the canyon walls. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun was setting behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the rugged canyon, when Jake Morrison, known as Reaper, heard the faint, desperate screams carried by the wind. It was the kind of scream that cut through the air like a knife, a scream filled with terror. For a moment, he hesitated, his mind racing. He had learned long ago not to get involved, not to let his heart lead him into situations that could only bring trouble. But this was different. The screams weren't just cries for help. They were the screams of a child. Jake knew the sound all too well. He had once been a child, lost and helpless, before his life had been shaped by the harsh realities of the road. It wasn't supposed to matter anymore. But something deep inside him stirred. He turned his bike towards the direction of the sound, the engine roaring to life beneath him. The wind howled in his face as he sped through the canyon, his heart pounding in his chest. As he followed the rapids, the water crashing violently against the rocks below, the screams grew louder, more frantic. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, and yet, he couldn't turn back. His instincts as a Hells Angels rider told him to keep going, to push forward, but his conscience, something he had long buried, was demanding he stop. The sun dipped lower, casting the canyon into an eerie twilight. Jake's mind flashed to the moments before, when his eyes had locked on the woman he had failed to save years ago. The memories of his past were like ghosts, always lingering, always haunting. He shook his head, trying to focus on the present, but the echo of the child's screams was impossible to ignore. The canyon was narrowing, the path ahead growing more treacherous. Jake's eyes scanned the area, searching for the source of the cries. And then, through the trees, he saw her, a small figure, barely visible against the backdrop of the churning rapids. She was clinging to a rock, her tiny body battered by the force of the water. Without thinking, Jake slammed his brakes, his bike skidding to a halt. He jumped off, rushing towards the edge of the water. "Hold on," he shouted, but the girl didn't respond. She was too weak, too afraid to hear him. His heart raced as he looked around for a way to reach her. The rapids were unforgiving, the water swirling violently beneath them. Without wasting another second, Jake jumped into the river, the cold water numbing his body instantly. He fought against the current, his muscles straining as he reached out to the girl. "I've got you," he said, his voice low and steady, trying to calm her. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. She was shaking, her lips pale from the cold. "You're safe now," Jake whispered, pulling her into his arms. But as he turned to make his way back to the shore, a sudden wave crashed over him, throwing him off balance. The force of the water was immense, and Jake struggled to keep his footing. The girl screamed again, her hands clutching desperately at him. "No, no, no," Jake muttered under his breath, pushing forward with everything he had. The water was up to his waist now, and the girl was slipping from his grip. He could feel the pull of the current, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He couldn't lose her. Not again. Not like this. With every ounce of strength, Jake managed to get back to the shore, his boots slipping on the wet rocks. He dragged the girl with him, the cold biting at his skin. His breath was ragged, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, they reached the safety of the canyon's edge. Jake collapsed onto the ground, the girl lying motionless in his arms. He checked her pulse, slow but steady. She was alive, but as he looked down at her, something in his chest tightened. There was more to this than just a random accident. Something was coming, and Jake knew he couldn't walk away from this. Now, the storm was just beginning. As Jake sat there, holding the little girl in his arms, the world around him felt like it was standing still. Her breath was slow but steady, and he could feel the heat from her small body against his, which made him wonder just how close he had come to losing her. He looked out across the raging river, now a mere blur beneath the dimming sky. The canyon's walls loomed over them like silent giants, casting long shadows across the rocky ground. He had saved her, No doubt about that. But Jake knew this was just the beginning. The night was growing colder, and the storm he'd sensed earlier was finally beginning to show its teeth. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and pushing the last traces of daylight into darkness. Jake's instincts, honed over years of surviving on the edge, told him that the danger wasn't over. He gently laid the girl down on the rocky ground, taking a moment to check her condition. She was pale, her eyes fluttering as if she were still lost in a fog of unconsciousness. His heart tightened. How long had she been out there? How had she ended up alone, stranded in the canyon? These were questions he knew he had to answer, but they would have to wait. He needed to get her to safety first. His eyes scanned the area, noting that the weather was turning faster than he had anticipated. The storm clouds had gathered overhead, and the wind had begun to howl louder, a warning of the chaos to come. Jake stood up, taking a deep breath, and began to search for shelter. It wasn't far before he found a small alcove in the canyon wall, just big enough to shield them from the worst of the storm. He carefully carried the girl over, his boots slipping on the wet rocks as he fought against the biting wind. Once they were under the overhang, he laid her down again, this time covering her with his leather jacket. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. He glanced around, making sure they weren't being followed. The sound of the river crashing below them echoed off the canyon walls, creating a rhythm that was both calming and unnerving at the same time. Jake's mind raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. The girl's sudden appearance, her screams for help, the way she'd clung to him like a lifeline. Something didn't add up. He had saved her, but from what? And why was she alone in a place like this? His thoughts were interrupted by a low groan from the girl. Her eyes were open now, blinking slowly as if the world around her was too much to process. Jake crouched beside her, his voice calm but urgent. "Hey, you're safe now," he said, his rough voice softening as he spoke to her. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl's gaze met his, her lips trembling. I don't know," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't remember." Jake's heart sank. She was in shock. He could tell by the way her words faltered, the way her small body shivered even under the warmth of his jacket. He needed to act fast. Without another word, Jake reached for his phone, but as he pulled it out, he realized the screen was cracked. The battery was almost dead. He cursed under his breath. He couldn't risk waiting for help. He had to find a way to get them both out of here. As the storm began to pick up, the wind howled louder, and the rain started coming down in heavy sheets. The sound of it pelting against the rocks made it almost impossible to hear anything else. Jake could feel the pressure building in his chest, the weight of the situation threatening to crush him. His mind raced, weighing his options. He could try to get back to the bike, but that would be risky in this weather. And even if he did, he couldn't guarantee he'd be able to make it to safety. No, he needed to stay put. The canyon was a dangerous place at night, and with the storm getting worse, they would have to wait it out. Jake glanced at the girl, still lying motionless beneath his jacket. He couldn't let her down. Not again. His eyes hardened with determination. He would protect her, no matter what it took. He had made that promise to himself long ago, to never leave anyone behind. And now, as the storm raged around them, he realized that promise was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. The night was far from over, and the real challenge was only just beginning. The storm raged on, the sound of the rain hammering against the canyon walls like a drumbeat. Jake sat against the rocky alcove, his back pressed firmly against the cold stone, his eyes scanning the wild landscape. The girl, still unconscious but breathing steadily, lay in his lap, wrapped tightly in his leather jacket. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the past few hours. It was a twist of fate that had brought him to this moment, but it wasn't just luck. It was something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. He knew he couldn't just leave her here. He had no idea who she was or how she had ended up in such a dangerous place, but that didn't matter right now. He had made a promise to protect her, and he wasn't going to break it. The wind howled, sending a cold chill through the narrow crevice. Jake pulled the girl closer, trying to shield her from the worst of the storm. His muscles ached from the exertion of carrying her, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep her alive, keep her safe. Her faint, shallow breathing was the only thing that kept him grounded. He glanced down at her, studying her fragile face. There was something about her that seemed so familiar, but he couldn't place it. Had he seen her before? Was there something he had missed? He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. It didn't matter who she was. What mattered was getting her to safety. Jake's mind kept drifting back to the moment when he had pulled her from the rapids. He had barely made it back to shore, the water pulling at them, the current strong enough to drag them both under. But somehow, against all odds, he had gotten her out. And now, as the storm raged on, he found himself wondering what had happened to the rest of the world. How long had they been out here? Hours? Days? It felt like time had stopped altogether. The girl stirred in his arms, her eyelids flickering open. Her wide eyes locked onto his, filled with confusion and fear. Who are you? She whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold and the shock. Jake's heart clenched at the sound of her voice. He had seen fear before, but this was different. This was a child, lost and alone. He pushed back his own emotions and spoke softly, trying to calm her. You're safe now, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You're with me. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. The girl's eyes filled with tears as she reached out weakly, her small hand brushing against his chest. Please. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice breaking. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. He knew that feeling. He had felt it before, that paralyzing fear, the feeling of being completely helpless. He had spent so many years running from his own fears, but now, in this moment, there was no place to run. He had to face them, for her. I know you're scared, he said, his voice rough but full of sincerity. But you're not alone. I'm here. He looked around the alcove, his mind racing. The storm was only getting worse. They couldn't stay here for much longer. The rain was turning into a torrential downpour, and the canyon was beginning to flood. They needed to move. Jake carefully adjusted his position, trying to make himself more comfortable as he cradled the girl in his arms. We need to get out of here, he muttered to himself, more to convince himself than anything else. The girl's eyes fluttered again, and she clung to him, her grip weak but desperate. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated for a moment, not knowing how to answer. Where could they go? The nearest town was miles away, and in this weather, it would be impossible to make it there on foot. But he couldn't stay here, not with the storm raging and the floodwaters rising. He had no choice but to keep moving, even if he didn't know where he was going. We're going to find shelter, he said, his voice firm. Just hang on. I won't let anything happen to you. With that, Jake rose to his feet, careful not to jostle the girl too much. The rain soaked through his clothes, but he barely noticed it as he adjusted her in his arms, his mind already focused on the journey ahead. The canyon seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the dark shadows of the storm casting everything in a haunting, ominous light. Every step was a gamble, every movement a test of his strength. He had never been more exhausted in his life, but he couldn't stop. Not now. The storm was only the beginning. The real danger, Jake knew, was still out there. He had no idea who was after the girl or why she had been left to die in the rapids, but he was going to find out. And he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. The rain pounded harder, the sound now a relentless drumbeat as Jake moved carefully through the canyon, his boots slipping on the slick rocks beneath him. The girl, still in his arms, was clinging to him, her small body shaking from the cold and the fear. He could feel her fingers gripping his jacket, tight and desperate, but there was nothing he could do to make her more comfortable. The storm wasn't just a nuisance anymore, it was a threat. The waters were rising, and they needed to get to higher ground. Jake's mind raced as he looked around the jagged canyon walls, trying to find a safe place, somewhere that might offer some shelter from the torrent of rain and wind. The girl's soft breaths against his chest were the only sign that she was still with him, still alive, and that was all that kept him going. Every step felt like an eternity, his muscles aching from the strain of carrying her, but he refused to stop. The thought of her slipping from his grasp, of losing her, was a feeling he couldn't bear. Hold on, Jake muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the girl. We're getting out of this, I promise. He knew he was pushing himself to the limit, but there was no time to rest. No time to think about the fatigue that was gnawing at his body. The storm was only getting worse. As the rain fell in sheets, it became harder and harder to see, the water blurring everything around him. The current of the river, once a distant sound, was now a loud, terrifying roar that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Jake had been in tough situations before, had survived wars, had fought through more pain and suffering than most people could ever imagine. But this was different. This wasn't about fighting a battle with enemies. It was about keeping this little girl safe. And he wasn't going to let her down. After what felt like hours, Jake spotted something up ahead, a small rise in the land that might offer them some shelter from the storm. It wasn't much, but it was their only hope. He pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. With every step, he prayed he wasn't too late. The girl stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. She was weak, barely able to hold her head up, but her voice, when she spoke, was strong enough to make Jake pause. Are we safe now? She whispered, her voice rough and cracked. Jake stopped, kneeling down in the wet mud. His arms were trembling from the effort of holding her, but he forced a smile, though it felt unnatural on his face. Not yet, he said, his voice low but firm. But we're getting there. Just a little further, okay? The girl nodded weakly, her head falling back against his chest. Jake stood up slowly, trying to keep his balance as the rain continued to fall in torrents. He had to get her to safety. That was the only thing that mattered right now. They reached the small rise in the land, a patch of rocky outcrop that offered some relief from the worst of the storm. It wasn't a cave or a shelter, but it was something. Jake laid her down gently on the ground, taking a moment to catch his breath. The wind howled around them, whipping through the canyon like a wild beast, but at least they were out of the water's reach. For now, he checked on the girl again, his eyes scanning her pale face for any signs of distress. She was still breathing, but her chest rose and fell with each breath in a way that made Jake uneasy. She was exhausted, her body too small to handle the cold and the stress of everything she had been through. Jake felt a pang of guilt. Had he done enough to protect her? Was she going to make it? The thought of losing her sent a shiver through his bones, one that had nothing to do with the cold. He couldn't bear the thought of failing her. He had failed before, and he wasn't going to do it again. He moved quickly, taking off his jacket and wrapping it around her again, trying to warm her as best he could. He couldn't start a fire. There was no time for that. Instead, he huddled beside her, using his body heat to shield her from the storm. He wasn't sure how much longer they could stay here. The storm was relentless, the floodwaters still rising, and he knew they couldn't stay on this rise forever. He needed to find a way to get them out of the canyon, to get her to safety, but the path was treacherous, and he was exhausted. As he sat there, his eyes fixed on the girl, he heard something in the distance. A sound that made his heart stop for a moment. It was the unmistakable roar of an engine, too close. Someone was out there. Someone was coming. Jake's hand instinctively went to the knife at his side, but he forced himself to stay calm. Whoever it was, he had to be ready. They weren't out of danger yet. He had to protect her, and that meant facing whatever was coming. The storm had hidden the danger long enough, but now, it seemed, the real test was just beginning. The roar of the engine grew louder, the sound cutting through the howling wind as Jake instinctively shifted his position, placing himself between the approaching noise and the girl. His eyes narrowed, scanning the dark silhouette coming through the storm. His pulse quickened, but he kept his breathing steady. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. He could see the faint outline of a motorcycle now, the headlights piercing through the rain like a beacon. Jake knew that they were not alone anymore. Someone was out here, and whether they were friend or foe, it didn't matter. He had to be prepared. He adjusted the girl's position in his arms, making sure she was as shielded as possible. The wind whipped around them, but they were protected for now by the rocky alcove. His grip tightened around the knife at his side. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation, but if it came down to it, he wasn't about to let anyone take the girl from him. The motorcycle slowed as it reached the rise where Jake and the girl had taken shelter. The headlights illuminated the area for a brief moment before the bike came to a halt. The rider dismounted, their heavy boots hitting the wet ground with a thud. Jake stood, his posture defensive, his eyes locked on the stranger, waiting for them to make the first move. The rider, a tall figure clad in a black leather jacket and a helmet, took a few steps toward them. The rain continued to fall in sheets, and for a moment, the only sound was the storm and the distant roar of the river. The rider stopped a few feet away, their face hidden behind the helmet, but their presence was unmistakable. Jake's hand hovered near his knife, but he didn't draw it. He needed answers, not conflict. "Who are you?" Jake's voice cut through the tension, his words sharp despite the fatigue in his body. The rider didn't answer immediately. Instead, they took a step forward, their eyes scanning the girl's unconscious form. Then, the rider spoke, their voice low and muffled behind the helmet. "I'm here to help," they said, their tone calm but firm. Jake didn't lower his guard, not yet. "Help? With what?" he demanded, his suspicion obvious. The rider paused for a moment, as if deciding whether to reveal anything more. Then, in a voice tinged with something Jake couldn't quite place, the rider said, "I've been looking for her." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air like a threat, but he didn't react immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Who is she to you?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. But inside, a storm of questions raged. The rider didn't answer right away, instead glancing at the girl again. Then, they took off their helmet, revealing a face that Jake didn't expect, a woman with dark eyes and a stern expression. She was older than he thought, maybe in her 40s, but there was something about her that didn't quite fit with the image Jake had of someone coming out into the storm. She wiped the rain from her face and looked directly at him. "She's my daughter," the woman said simply. Jake froze. The revelation hit him harder than the rain. This little girl, the one he had fought so hard to protect, was someone else's child. The weight of the situation hit him like a tidal wave. He had no idea who the woman was, but if she was telling the truth, the stakes had just been raised. The woman seemed to sense his hesitation, and stepped closer, her voice softening. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her eyes locked on his. "But I promise you, I'm not here to hurt her. I just need to get her back." Jake's mind was spinning. He had just saved this girl's life, had fought against the storm, the river, and his own fears to keep her alive, and now a stranger appeared, claiming to be her mother. His instinct was to protect her, but the sudden twist left him with more questions than answers. Why had this woman been looking for her? And why hadn't she been there when the girl needed her the most? His fingers loosened on the knife, but the doubt in his mind was still there, burning like an ember. "You expect me to just hand her over?" Jake's voice was colder now, the protective instinct kicking in once again. The woman's face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I don't want to take her from you," she said, her voice low and pleading. "I've been trying to get to her, but things got complicated." Jake's suspicion didn't ease, but the tone of her voice made him hesitate. There was something about her story that felt genuine, but Jake wasn't about to make any assumptions just yet. He looked at the girl again, her small form so fragile in the harsh conditions. He had promised to protect her, but who was he really protecting her from? "Tell me what happened," Jake demanded. "Why was she alone in the canyon?" The woman's gaze fell, her jaw tightening. "She ran away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "From a life I couldn't give her. From a world I couldn't protect her from." Jake's heart sank. It wasn't just the storm that had driven this girl into the canyon. It was something much darker. Something that the woman was too afraid to fully say out loud. "I know what you're thinking," she added, her eyes lifting to meet his again. "But I swear, I would never have let her go if I had any other choice." Jake studied her for a long moment, the tension between them thick and unresolved. The storm still raged, and in that moment, Jake realized that the answers he needed weren't here yet. He had to know more. But before he could speak, the girl stirred in his arms, her eyelids flickering open once again. It seemed that the storm was far from over, and neither was the mystery of what was really going on. The girl's eyes fluttered open, and Jake felt a rush of relief wash over him, though it was quickly overshadowed by the uncertainty in the air. The storm had settled into a heavy drizzle, but the darkness of the canyon remained thick, pressing in on them from all sides. The woman, still standing a few feet away, waited in silence, her eyes locked on her daughter, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His fingers tightened around the handle of his knife as he instinctively moved to shield the girl. "Are you okay?" Jake asked softly, looking down at the girl, his voice a comforting whisper. She blinked a few times, her small face pale but calm. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice still weak. "You're safe," Jake replied, trying to reassure her. "You're with me now." The girl's eyes darted between him and the woman, confusion clouding her expression. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice cracking. The question hung in the air like an unspoken challenge, and Jake's mind raced. The woman, who had been watching with quiet intensity, took a step forward. "I'm your mom," she said, her voice breaking the stillness. "I've been looking for you." The girl's face twisted in disbelief, her small hands clutching at the damp fabric of Jake's jacket. "No," she whispered, shaking her head slightly. "No, you're not. My mom wouldn't leave me." The woman's face tightened, and Jake could see the pain in her eyes, the kind of pain only a mother could understand. "I never wanted to leave you, sweetheart," she said softly. "But there were things I couldn't control." Jake stood silently, watching the emotional exchange. The girl's confusion and fear were palpable, but so was the mother's anguish. The storm, though lessened, still raged on around them, as if it were mirroring the turmoil within their small group. The woman stepped closer to the girl, her hands outstretched in an attempt to reach her. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to think I abandoned you." The girl shrank back, shaking her head, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "I don't want to go with you," she whispered, her voice small but full of conviction. Jake could see the pain in both their eyes, but he knew he couldn't let this moment spiral into something more dangerous. He stepped between them, his body blocking the woman from the girl's view. "Enough," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This isn't the time. She's been through enough tonight." The woman recoiled slightly, as though his words had struck her harder than any physical blow could. Jake's eyes softened as he turned to face her. "You need to explain what's going on, and I need to know the truth." The woman's face softened, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of her guilt had finally caught up with her. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before she spoke again. "I wasn't always the mother I should have been," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I got involved with the wrong people. People who threatened everything I loved. I thought I was doing what was best for her, keeping her away from all of that, but it only made things worse. So I left." Jake frowned, his hand still on the knife at his side. "And now?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "Now, I want to fix it," the woman replied, her voice filled with resolve. "I've spent the last year trying to find her, trying to keep her safe, but the people I ran from, they found me. And they'll find her if I don't get her back." Jake's heart began to race. This wasn't just a family reunion, it was a warning. "Who are these people?" he demanded, stepping closer to her. "What do they want?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward the shadows of the canyon, as if she feared someone might be watching. "I can't explain it all now," she said, her voice frantic. "But I swear, I'm not here to hurt her. I just need to get her away from them before it's too late." Jake's grip on his knife tightened as he turned back to the girl, who was still watching them with wide, frightened eyes. Her small hands were trembling in his, and for the first time, Jake realized that he didn't know what to do. He had promised to protect her, but now there were too many layers to this situation, too many people, and too many dangers. "You can't just take her," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "Not like this. Not without answers." The woman looked like she was about to protest, but she stopped herself, taking a step back. "I understand," she said quietly. "I know I can't ask you to trust me right now. But please, I beg you, don't let her stay here in this storm." Jake looked down at the girl again. Her face was streaked with tears, her body still trembling from the cold and the shock. He knew he couldn't leave her alone with the storm and with all the uncertainty that surrounded them. "We need to move," Jake said, his voice finally softening. "But we do this my way. We're not making any decisions until we're safe." The woman nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, as Jake helped her take the girl in his arms. "Thank you for not giving up on her." Jake didn't say anything in return. He couldn't. His mind was still spinning, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. But for now, they had to keep moving. The truth would come out eventually, but they had to survive the night first. The night dragged on, the wind picking up again as Jake led the woman and the girl through the canyon. The rain was still coming down in heavy sheets, and the cold was seeping into their bones. They had found a small shelter under an overhang, but it wasn't enough. The canyon's walls towered over them, the darkness swallowing up the path ahead. Jake felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had promised to protect the girl, but now there were too many unknowns. The woman was still with them, walking beside him, her eyes constantly shifting between Jake and her daughter. She hadn't spoken much since the revelation that the girl was hers, But Jake knew the tension between them hadn't dissipated. He glanced over at her, his voice low. I need you to tell me everything. Who are these people you're running from? What's really going on? The woman hesitated, her eyes darting to the girl, who was walking quietly beside them, her small hand clutching Jake's jacket. I can't explain everything right now, the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. But they're dangerous. They've been hunting me for months. I had to leave her behind to keep her safe, but I never meant to. I didn't wanna. Her voice faltered, and she looked down at the ground. Jake's hand instinctively tightened around his knife, but he kept his tone even. If you want me to trust you, you need to tell me what you're really up against. The woman stopped walking and took a deep breath, looking over at Jake. I was involved with people, bad people, she began, her voice shaky. They're not just criminals. They're dangerous in ways that go beyond anything I've ever seen. When I tried to get away, they started looking for me. And then they started looking for her. She paused, as if weighing whether to continue. The truth is, I wasn't strong enough to protect her before. I didn't know how bad it was until it was too late. But I swear, I'm here now to make sure they never find her. I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe. Jake studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. He wasn't sure if he believed her completely, but he knew they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The girl's safety was the priority. He looked down at her, her face pale in the dim light. She had barely spoken since they started walking, her eyes still wide with confusion and fear. What do you need from me? Jake asked, breaking the silence. The woman shook her head. I don't know. I just need to get her somewhere safe. Somewhere far from all this. Jake nodded, his gaze lingering on the girl. We'll keep moving, he said. But you need to understand, I'm not just handing her over to you. Not until I know she's safe. You need to prove to me that you're the one who can protect her. The woman looked at him with gratitude, but there was still uncertainty in her eyes. I understand, she said quietly. But I promise you, I won't stop until she's safe. I've made too many mistakes already. I'm not going to let her pay the price for them. Jake didn't reply. Instead, he turned and began walking again, leading them through the rugged terrain. His mind was still racing. He had to keep the girl safe, but he didn't know who he could trust anymore. There were too many layers to this story, too many people involved. All he knew was that he couldn't let anyone else get in their way. The storm continued to rage, but the weight of the night seemed to press heavier with each step. The distant sound of the river rushing through the canyon echoed in the darkness, a constant reminder of the danger they were still facing. They needed to find shelter, and they needed to do it fast. As they moved deeper into the canyon, Jake heard a noise behind them, a faint crackling sound. He stopped, his senses on high alert. The woman looked at him, her face tense. What was that? She whispered. Jake raised a hand to signal silence, his eyes scanning the shadows. The sound grew louder, a crunching noise followed by the unmistakable hum of a motorcycle engine. They're here, Jake muttered under his breath. The woman's eyes widened in fear. No, they can't be here. Not now. Jake turned to face her, his expression hardening. Get down, he said urgently. They'll see us if we stay exposed. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her behind a large boulder. The girl clung to his side, her small body trembling. They crouched low, the sound of the motorcycle engines growing closer with every second. Jake's hand was on the knife at his side, but he knew he couldn't fight a full group of them. His best chance was to stay hidden and wait for the right moment to act. The woman's face was pale with fear. Please, don't let them find us, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded, keeping his eyes on the path ahead. He didn't know who these people were, but he had no intention of letting them find the girl. Not while he was still breathing. The motorcycle engines roared as they passed, the riders seemingly unaware of their presence. Jake held his breath, praying they wouldn't stop, praying they wouldn't find them. He waited until the sound of the engines faded into the distance before slowly standing up. He looked at the woman. We have to move. Now. The woman nodded, her face still filled with fear. I know. They set off again, this time with more urgency. Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but he didn't stop. Not yet. They had made it this far, and he wasn't going to let them down now. They still had a long way to go before they were truly safe, but for now, they had to keep moving. Every step they took brought them closer to the truth, and closer to the danger that was closing in on them. The night seemed to stretch on forever as Jake led the woman and the girl deeper into the canyon. The rain had finally slowed to a drizzle, but the threat of danger was far from over. The wind still howled through the narrow passageways, and the sound of rushing water echoed off the stone walls, reminding them that they weren't out of the woods yet. Jake's mind was constantly on edge. He had saved the girl, yes, but now there were too many questions left unanswered. Who were these people chasing her? Why had the woman been forced to leave her behind in the first place? And what had she really meant when she said she was running from something darker than just criminals? These thoughts kept swirling around in Jake's mind, but he knew there was no time for answers. Not yet. He had to keep them safe first. His hand rested lightly on the hilt of his knife as they moved through the darkness. The girl was quiet now, her small body still trembling slightly, but her steps were more steady than before. The woman walked just behind him, still tense, still cautious. The closer they got to what Jake hoped would be their shelter, the more he could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. They were walking into unknown territory, and Jake knew the danger wasn't just from the storm anymore. There was something else out here, something that had followed them. The sound of the motorcycle engines from earlier was still fresh in his mind, the memory of their low growl sending a shiver down his spine. He had no idea who they were, but the fact that they had been so close to finding them meant that they were still a threat. Jake stopped abruptly, his hand raised in a signal for the others to halt. The woman immediately froze, her eyes scanning the area. The girl looked up at him, her expression confused but trusting. "What is it?" the woman whispered, her voice tight with concern. Jake didn't answer immediately. He had heard something, footsteps. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there. Someone was coming. He motioned for the woman and the girl to stay hidden behind a large boulder. "Stay here. Don't move," he said, his voice low but urgent. He could see the woman's eyes flicker with hesitation, but she nodded and crouched down beside the girl. Jake crept forward, his boots making little noise against the damp ground. His every instinct was on high alert as he moved closer to the source of the sound. The footsteps were getting louder now, coming closer. He reached the edge of a large rock outcrop and peered around it, his heart pounding in his chest. What he saw made his blood run cold. Two men were coming down the path, moving in silence, their eyes scanning the ground as if they were tracking something or someone. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by hoods. Jake's grip on his knife tightened. He had no idea who these men were, but he had a feeling they weren't just random wanderers. They were here for the girl, and they were getting closer. Jake knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to act. He backed away silently, moving carefully to rejoin the woman and the girl. When he reached them, he held up his hand to signal for silence. The woman's face was tense, her eyes wide with worry. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jake cut her off with a quick shake of his head. "They're close," he whispered. "We need to move, now." The woman didn't ask any questions. She simply nodded and grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her gently to her feet. Jake motioned for them to follow him, and they began moving quickly but quietly through the canyon. Every step felt like it could be their last. The sound of the men's footsteps was still ringing in his ears as they made their way deeper into the darkness. Jake knew they couldn't outrun them, not with the storm, not with the rough terrain. Their only hope was to find a place to hide, somewhere the men couldn't easily find them. As they rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, Jake spotted something, a small cave tucked into the side of the rocks, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He motioned for the others to follow him, and they hurried into the cave, hiding themselves in the shadows. Jake pressed himself against the back of the cave, his heart racing. He could hear the men's voices now, muffled by the distance, but they were getting closer. He had no idea how much longer they had before the men found them. "Stay here," Jake whispered to the woman, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "Don't move until I tell you." The woman nodded, holding her daughter close. Jake peeked out of the cave, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of the men. The wind had died down, but the storm was still raging in the distance. He could barely make out the figures of the two men as they passed by, just a few yards away from their hiding spot. He held his breath, his body tensed and ready to move at a moment's notice. The men stopped just outside the cave, their voices growing louder as they spoke to each other. Jake couldn't make out their words, but he could tell they were searching for something, or someone. "They must be close," one of the men said, his voice low and harsh. "Keep your eyes peeled." The other man grunted in agreement, and Jake heard their footsteps move away from the cave. He waited, not daring to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps grew fainter, and the men were finally out of earshot. Jake let out a quiet sigh of relief, his shoulders sagging slightly. They were safe, for now. But he knew this wasn't over. The danger was still out there, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. He turned back to the woman and the girl, his face grim. "We have to keep moving," he said. "But we need to be careful. We're not out of danger yet." The woman nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. Jake could see the trust in her eyes, but he couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep running. The truth was, they didn't have much time. The storm was still raging, and the threat of being found was growing by the minute. The rain had finally slowed to a light mist, but the air was still thick with tension. Jake knew they couldn't stay in the cave much longer. The storm was passing, but it had made their position vulnerable, and the men searching for them would soon figure out they weren't just passing through. His mind raced, processing every possible outcome as he kept an eye on the entrance to the cave. The woman and the girl were still huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. The girl's face was pale, her body trembling from the cold and the exhaustion. Jake's heart clenched as he looked at her. She had been through more than any child should have to endure, and it weighed heavily on him. He promised himself that he wouldn't fail her, not this time. "We need to move," Jake whispered, his voice steady, though the words hung heavy in the air. The woman nodded, her expression still tight with worry. She had remained silent since their close call with the men, but Jake could tell she was fighting her own internal battle. She hadn't given him all the answers yet, and while he knew she was still holding something back, he also knew that right now, they didn't have the luxury of time to deal with it. "How far is it to safety?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low but firm. The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's a cabin," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "It's not far. We can make it before they regroup, but we have to move fast." Jake looked at the girl one more time, making sure she was still holding up. She was clinging to the woman now, her small frame trembling but determined. He nodded. "Lead the way," he said, his voice resolute. They had no time to waste. The storm had passed, but danger was still very real, and they needed to keep moving. The woman led them out of the cave, her eyes scanning the path ahead, her steps sure and swift. Jake stayed close behind, his senses on high alert. The canyon's narrow walls closed in around them as they moved forward, the mist still lingering in the air, making everything feel eerie and surreal. The girl's footsteps were soft against the wet ground, but Jake could hear her labored breathing, the sound of her fragile body struggling to keep up. He looked at her again, his protective instincts kicking in. He wanted to pick her up, carry her, but he knew they had to keep moving fast. If they stayed in one place for too long, the men would find them. The woman glanced back at them, her eyes full of regret and worry. "We're almost there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a little longer." Jake nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The farther they went, the more questions piled up in his head. Who were these men? What had they done to this family? And why did the woman leave her daughter behind in the first place? He had no answers, but he had made a promise, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers now. They moved on, the path growing steeper and more difficult as they ascended into the higher part of the canyon. The ground was slick with mud, and the trees began to thin out, replaced by jagged rocks and sharp cliffs. Jake's eyes scanned the landscape ahead, his hand resting on the knife at his side. He could feel the danger closing in again, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Suddenly, the woman stopped in her tracks, holding up a hand to signal for them to stop. Jake froze, his eyes darting around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The woman's face was tense, her eyes narrowed as she scanned the area ahead. "We're not alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't the wind or the rain that was making him feel this way. It was something else, something darker. He took a cautious step forward, trying to peer through the mist, but he couldn't see anything. No movement, no sound, just the fixed silence of the canyon. "What do you mean?" Jake whispered, his voice tense. The woman didn't answer right away, but she reached out and pulled the girl closer to her side, her protective instincts kicking in. "They found us," she said, her voice shaking now. They're out there. I don't know how many, but they're close. Jake cursed under his breath. The storm had passed, but now they were facing another kind of threat. A more dangerous one. The men were hunting them, and they weren't going to stop until they found them. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't just sit and wait to be caught. They needed to act fast. We need to get to that cabin now, Jake said, his voice low but urgent. The woman nodded, her eyes filled with fear but also determination. This way, she said, motioning for them to follow her. They moved quickly, the woman leading the way, her pace faster now, her eyes darting to every shadow in the canyon. Jake stayed close, the girl clinging to the woman's side. He could feel the pressure mounting with every step they took, the sense of being hunted growing stronger. They weren't safe yet, and Jake knew they wouldn't be until they reached that cabin. As they moved on, the sounds of the canyon grew quieter, the only noise now the pounding of their footsteps against the wet ground. Then, just as they reached the top of a small hill, the woman stopped again, her eyes wide with fear. It's too late, she whispered. They're here. Jake turned around just in time to see two men emerge from the mist, their figures tall and imposing. The hunters had found them. The chase was on again, and this time, Jake knew they had no choice but to face whatever came next. The two men moved toward them, their footsteps heavy and purposeful, cutting through the silence of the canyon. Jake's heart raced as he instinctively stepped in front of the woman and the girl, positioning himself between them and the approaching threat. He knew he couldn't afford to hesitate now. His hand rested on the knife at his side, ready to act if it came to that. The men stopped a few feet away, their cold eyes scanning Jake, the woman, and the girl with a calculating gaze. Jake could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Thought you could outrun us, huh? The first man said, his voice low and gravelly, with a mocking edge. It's over. We've been tracking you for days. The second man, taller and more muscular, cracked his knuckles, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the woman. You should have stayed out of it, lady. This girl's ours, and you're not going to keep her. Jake's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to let them take her, no matter who they were. You're not taking anyone, Jake said firmly, his voice steady. But the fire in his eyes unmistakable. Not while I'm standing here. The first man grinned, taking a step closer, sizing Jake up. You think you can stop us? You're outnumbered, and you're not in control here. The tension in the air was palpable. The wind howled around them, adding to the sense of urgency. Jake's mind was racing, calculating his next move. He couldn't risk a fight with these men, not with the girl and the woman so close by. He had to buy time. This isn't your fight, Jake said, his voice sharp, trying to shift the focus. If you want her, you'll have to go through me. The second man sneered. That's exactly the idea. Without warning, he lunged toward Jake, his fist aimed for Jake's jaw. But Jake was faster. He sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back, using his momentum to throw him to the ground. The first man's eyes widened in shock as Jake moved with surprising speed. He wasn't just a biker, he was a survivor. The second man struggled, but Jake had him pinned, his knee pressing down hard on his back. Stay down, Jake growled, his grip tightening. The first man hesitated, his gaze flickering between his partner and Jake, then back to the woman and the girl. He was calculating, deciding whether to engage or retreat. The woman took a step forward, her voice shaky but determined. Please, she said, her hands raised in a defensive gesture. We just want to be left alone. Take whatever you want, but please, leave us in peace. Jake's eyes flicked to her, then back to the first man. This wasn't just about money or power, it was something personal. Jake could feel it. You want peace, the first man sneered. You should have thought of that before you crossed us. He stepped forward, but Jake was already moving. He kicked the man's legs out from under him, sending him stumbling to the ground. The man hit the ground hard, rolling away to regain his balance. Jake stood over him, knife in hand. I said, stay down. Jake repeated, his voice cold. The man's eyes were full of rage now, but he was also wary. You're making a big mistake, friend, he spat. This won't end well for you. Jake narrowed his eyes, not backing down. I'm not the one making a mistake, he said. You're the ones who've already lost. The man hesitated, his fist clenched in frustration, but he knew better than to challenge Jake further. There was something in the way Jake held himself, something that made him dangerous, and the man knew it. He got to his feet slowly, glancing at his partner, who was still struggling under Jake's weight. The second man's face was twisted in anger, but he was already thinking about retreating. He knew they were outmatched. "This isn't over," the first man said, his voice low and filled with venom. "We'll be back. And next time, you won't be so lucky." With that, he turned and motioned for the second man to follow. They backed away slowly, still glaring at Jake, but neither of them made a move to attack again. As they disappeared into the mist, Jake stood motionless, his hands still clutching the knife, his body coiled like a spring. The danger wasn't over, but for now, they were safe. Jake let out a slow breath, his heart still pounding. He turned to face the woman and the girl. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentler now. The woman nodded, her face pale, but filled with gratitude. The girl clung to her mother, still trembling but no longer as frightened. Jake could see the weight of the situation pressing down on them. They had made it through this round, but Jake knew this was just the beginning. They had no idea who these men were or how far they would go to get what they wanted. But one thing was certain, Jake wasn't going to stop fighting until they were safe. "Let's keep moving," Jake said, his voice steady but urgent. "We can't stay here." The woman nodded again, her eyes filled with both relief and fear. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To the cabin," Jake said firmly. "We need to get you both somewhere safe. And we need to figure out what's really going on." With that, they turned and began walking again, the storm now a distant memory but the danger still hanging over them. Jake didn't know what the next move would be, but he was ready. Whatever it took, he would protect them. The journey wasn't over, and Jake wasn't going to let them face it alone. They moved swiftly through the canyon, the looming shadows of the cliffs above them growing longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The air was still heavy with the tension from their close call with the two men. Jake stayed a few steps ahead, his senses on high alert. He didn't trust that they were truly safe yet, not with the storm behind them and the unknown threats still lurking. The woman and the girl kept up with him, though their steps were slower, the weight of fear still clinging to them. The girl was quieter now, her small hand gripping her mother's as if she were afraid to let go. The woman walked beside her, her face pale but determined. They hadn't spoken much since the confrontation, but Jake could feel the unspoken questions between them. The woman had promised she wanted to keep her daughter safe, but what had she gotten them into? Who were these people chasing them? Jake glanced over his shoulder at the woman. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but urgent. She nodded, glancing at the girl, then back at him. "I know," she said quietly, her voice laced with guilt. "But not now. We need to keep moving." Jake didn't argue. He understood. They were still vulnerable, exposed. They had to keep putting distance between themselves and the men who were hunting them. But he needed answers. The woman had kept so much hidden, and Jake had no intention of letting her off the hook. He had promised to protect the girl, and that meant understanding exactly what they were up against. They walked for a few more minutes, the rocky path growing steeper as they ascended toward the cabin the woman had mentioned. Jake's legs ached from the constant movement, but he didn't stop. The others were relying on him, and he wasn't about to slow down. His mind kept circling back to the events of the day, trying to piece together the puzzle. He could still hear the sound of the motorcycle engines echoing in his ears, and the cold, calculated way the men had approached them. Whoever they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. The woman and the girl had no idea just how dangerous things were about to get. "We're close," the woman said suddenly, her voice breaking into Jake's thoughts. He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "Close. To what?" "The cabin," she explained, pointing toward a small rise in the distance. "It's just over there. It's not much, but it's hidden. We'll be safe there for a while." Jake studied her face, his instincts still on edge. He didn't trust this whole situation, but he didn't have much choice. For now, the cabin was their best chance. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. They quickened their pace, the path becoming more rugged as they climbed higher. The girl was starting to tire, her steps slowing as the exhaustion from the day caught up with her. Jake could see the weariness on her face, and he could feel his own fatigue pressing in on him. They had to make it to the cabin soon. As they crested the rise, Jake saw the cabin in the distance, a small, weathered building nestled against the side of the mountain. It was almost hidden from view, the thick trees surrounding it acting as a natural barrier. Jake's eyes scanned the area around the cabin, looking for any sign of danger. There were no signs of life, no movement. For now, it seemed safe. "We're here," the woman said, a sense of relief in her voice. She stepped forward, leading the way as they approached the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, and Jake's hand instinctively went to the handle of his knife as he stepped inside. The cabin was dark, musty, and smelled of old wood and dust. The woman moved inside first, guiding the girl toward the small hearth at the far end of the room. "It's not much," she said, glancing around at the dilapidated interior. "But it'll keep us hidden for a while." Jake followed them inside, closing the door softly behind him. The room was sparsely furnished, with only a few old chairs and a table in the center. There was a small stove in the corner, and a few shelves of canned goods and dried food. Jake moved to the window, peering out through the cracked glass. He could see nothing but the trees and the rocky terrain surrounding the cabin. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, but only slightly. They had found shelter, but the danger wasn't over. The woman was watching him now, her face tense, her eyes filled with something. Fear, guilt, or maybe both. Jake knew she wasn't ready to talk yet, but he couldn't wait much longer. He needed to know what was going on, what kind of enemies they were dealing with. He turned to face her, his voice steady but insistent. "You owe me an explanation," he said, his gaze unwavering. She flinched, then looked down at the girl, who had curled up in one of the chairs by the fire. The woman's expression softened as she looked at her daughter, but then she met Jake's eyes again. "I know," she said quietly. "I'll tell you everything. But not tonight. She's exhausted, and I don't want to scare her any more than she already is." Jake hesitated, his mind still spinning, but he nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "But tomorrow I need answers. We're not safe yet." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered. "And I'll tell you everything. I swear." Jake didn't say anything more. He moved to the far side of the room and leaned against the wall, his eyes never leaving the door. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. The storm had passed, but the real storm was just beginning. And the truth was something they would all have to face, whether they were ready or not. The cabin was eerily quiet as Jake sat against the wall, keeping a vigilant eye on the door. The woman and the girl were both trying to settle in, the weight of the night clearly heavy on them. The girl had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, wrapped in a thick blanket, her small body still trembling despite the warmth. The woman, on the other hand, sat on the opposite side of the room, her eyes haunted, her hands fidgeting as she stared into the flickering flames. Jake could feel the exhaustion creeping up on him, but he couldn't relax. Not yet. Not until he had answers. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. This wasn't just about a mother trying to protect her daughter. It was bigger than that. And as much as Jake wanted to wait until tomorrow, his patience was wearing thin. He needed to know what kind of danger they were really facing. The woman hadn't offered much in terms of explanation, but he was done waiting. He pushed himself off the wall and walked over to her, standing in front of her for a long moment. She didn't look up at first, but then, sensing his presence, she finally met his gaze. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head, his jaw set. "I can't protect her if I don't know who I'm protecting her from," he said, his voice low but firm. The woman sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you in the middle of this. But you're right. You deserve to know." She paused, taking a deep breath before she continued. "The men who've been after us, well, they're not just any criminals. They're part of something bigger, something dangerous. They've been tracking me for a long time." Jake stayed silent, watching her intently. The woman seemed to be working through her own emotions, her gaze shifting to the fire as she spoke. "I used to be involved with them," she said, her voice shaky. "I got out when I realized how bad it was, but not before they knew too much. I didn't know what they were really capable of until it was too late. They've done things, terrible things. And now, they want my daughter. They want to use her. I don't know exactly how or why, but they've been hunting us ever since I left." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Jake's mind raced as he processed what she had said. He had suspected there was more to this story, but the magnitude of it hit him hard. These weren't just ordinary criminals. They were part of something much darker. He turned away, running a hand through his hair as he tried to piece it all together. "And these people you were involved with, "They're still after you?" he asked, his voice tense. The woman nodded, her face grim. "Yes, and they won't stop. They think I know something, or they think I have something that they want. They won't rest until they find me, and they'll hurt anyone who stands in their way." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. He had promised to protect this girl, but now he realized just how dangerous the situation really was. The woman continued, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I didn't want to drag anyone else into this, especially not you. You've done enough. But I don't have any other options. They won't stop coming for us. I can't run anymore. They'll catch up with us eventually, no matter how far we go." Jake's hand tightened into a fist. "They're not going to get you. Not while I'm still standing." He turned to the girl, still sleeping soundly in the chair, her face peaceful despite everything that had happened. "You've got a good mother," Jake said, his voice softer now. The woman gave a faint smile, but it quickly faded as she looked back at her daughter. "I failed her," she said quietly, her voice filled with regret. "I should have been stronger. I should have protected her better." Jake didn't respond at first. He knew that feeling, that crushing guilt. The feeling that no matter how much you fought, you always fell short. But he wasn't about to let her drown in it. "You're here now," he said simply. "That's what matters." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "I just want her to be safe," she whispered. Jake watched her for a moment, then turned back toward the door. The feeling of danger had not left him, and the gnawing sense of urgency was still there. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low and steady. The woman's eyes shot up to meet his. "What do you mean? We've barely made it here. We can't stay here," Jake interrupted. "We've only got so much time before they catch up with us. The cabin won't be enough. We need to go farther. There's a town about 2 days' walk from here. It's the safest place I know, and I don't think anyone will be looking there." The woman's face was filled with uncertainty, but Jake could see the spark of hope in her eyes. She didn't have a choice anymore. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll go." Jake moved to the window, peering out into the misty forest. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. But the town he spoke of was their best chance. He didn't know what waited for them there, but it was their only option. They couldn't stay hidden forever. "Get some rest," Jake said, turning back to the woman. "We leave at first light." He didn't wait for a reply. The weight of everything that had happened, and everything still to come, settled heavily on his shoulders. But he was ready to protect them, ready to fight. Whatever came next, he wasn't backing down. Not this time. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin. Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had barely slept, his mind racing with what had happened, what was yet to come, and the truth he still didn't have. The woman and the girl had managed to sleep for a few hours, but the weight of the journey ahead was pressing on all of them. They had to move now. They couldn't risk staying here any longer. He had promised to protect them, and he was going to keep that promise, no matter what. Jake turned away from the window and moved toward the woman and the girl. The woman was already up, her eyes tired but focused. She had been quiet this morning, lost in her thoughts, but Jake knew she was preparing for the next step. The girl was sitting on the edge of the chair, her small hands clutching the blanket tightly. She hadn't spoken much, but the fear in her eyes told Jake everything he needed to know. "We leave in 20 minutes, Jake said, his voice low and steady. The woman nodded, her face full of gratitude but also concern. "Are you sure this is the best idea?" she asked quietly. "We'll be exposed. They could still be out there looking for us." Jake met her gaze, his expression hardening. "It's the only option we have. We need to get to the town. It's the safest place I know." The woman nodded, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He didn't blame her. They were all in uncharted territory now, but he wasn't about to back down. They had to keep moving forward. He walked over to the girl and knelt in front of her, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. The girl looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with silent fear. She didn't answer, but she nodded, her small hand still gripping the blanket. Jake placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "We're going to make it," he said quietly. "You're safe." Now, the girl didn't speak, but there was a faint flicker of trust in her eyes. Jake stood up and moved toward the door. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever came next. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. They weren't out of danger. Not by a long shot. But he wasn't going to let fear control him. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice steady. The woman stood, helping the girl to her feet. They moved quickly, Jake leading the way as they stepped outside into the cool morning air. The mist had lifted, but the forest still felt heavy, the quiet broken only by the sound of their footsteps. Jake glanced over his shoulder, scanning the woods. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They moved along the trail, the path now more familiar as they climbed higher into the mountains. The terrain was rough, and the weight of the situation was starting to wear on all of them. The girl was lagging behind, her steps slow and labored. Jake could see the exhaustion in her face, and he knew they needed to keep up the pace if they were going to make it to the town before nightfall. "How much farther?" the woman asked, her voice tight with worry. "A few hours," Jake replied. "We need to keep moving, though. We don't know when they'll catch up." The woman nodded, her expression grim. She glanced back at the girl, who was struggling to keep up. "She can't keep going like this," the woman said, her voice tinged with panic. Jake slowed his pace, walking beside the girl. "We're almost there," he said softly. "Just a little longer, okay?" The girl looked up at him, her face pale but determined. She nodded, though it was clear she was struggling. "I'm sorry," the woman said quietly. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Jake glanced at her, his eyes hard. "It's not over," he said firmly. "We're not safe yet, but we're getting closer." The tension in the air was palpable, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He kept scanning the trees, his hand on his knife, ready for anything. As they continued down the path, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light across the trail ahead. It felt like a sign, a small hope in the midst of all the uncertainty. They were close. The town was just ahead. Jake could almost taste it. They rounded a bend, and there it was, the small town he had promised. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but Jake didn't hesitate. They were almost there. As they approached the outskirts of the town, Jake felt a slight shift in the air. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something wasn't right. He looked around, trying to figure out what it was, but there was no movement, no sound. It was as if the entire town had been abandoned. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice low. He moved ahead cautiously, his senses on high alert. The woman and the girl followed behind him, their footsteps barely audible. They reached the edge of the town, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. The streets were empty, the buildings standing silent in the early morning light. There was no sign of life. No one was around. It was like a ghost town. Jake stopped, his mind racing. Something was off. He could feel it in his gut. He turned to the woman. "This doesn't feel right," he said. "Where is everyone?" She shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know," she said softly. "I thought it would be safe here." Jake's grip on his knife tightened. He wasn't sure what they had walked into, but one thing was clear, they weren't alone. The storm had passed, but the real storm was just beginning. In this gripping tale of survival and danger, the story unfolds with a fierce and determined biker, deep in the heart of the wilderness, doing everything he can to protect a young girl and her mother from a dangerous threat. As the chase intensifies, Jake's past as a Hells Angels member comes into play, testing his loyalty, his instincts, and his ability to keep the promise he made to protect those in need. With each passing hour, the stakes grow higher as they try to escape the relentless men hunting them. As they find themselves hiding in a remote cabin, they soon realize that danger is never far behind. This is one of the most intense Hells Angels stories you'll read, filled with suspense, action, and a haunting look at what it means to be bound by a promise, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In this gripping Hells Angels story, Jake must navigate through his own troubled past while trying to protect those who have become his responsibility. As they fight for survival, Jake's bond with the girl grows stronger, and his dedication to keeping her safe becomes more powerful than ever. But the true test is still ahead, and as the tension rises, the truth about who is hunting them and why will change everything. These Hells Angels stories capture the raw emotion of betrayal, survival, and the undying commitment to protect others, no matter the cost. The character's journey in this tale brings a deep emotional resonance, and as the chapters unfold, you'll see the emotional and physical challenges Jake faces as he fights to shield his newfound family. Filled with unexpected twists and a gritty look into the lives of those caught in dangerous situations, This story is a must-read for fans of Hell's Angels stories and tales of redemption and loyalty.